Hello. In an ideal world, every child would have a happy, healthy and safe upbringing in their own home with their own family. In reality, though, many children are born into so-called problem families. But is our social service system too quick to take children into care and have them forcibly adopted? It's a hugely controversial issue that's dividing experts, politicians and families. Now Europe is looking at whether it does happen here too often. Royce reports.
Forcible adoption is the most draconian outcome in United Kingdom law since the abolition of the death penalty.
There's not a day that you don't think about them or wonder where they are or if they're all right, or am I doing enough to fight to get them home? What more can I do?
People lose sight of what actually matters, and the whole point of social services is that it is meant to support families in the community. It is meant to help families stay together, and in the UK it is very much doing the opposite.
We are obsessed with adoption, that it is seen to be best to get a child taken from a family and adopted, rather than doing what's best for the child.
They say it's the worst thing that can happen to a mother, to lose a child. But what happens when it's the state that takes your baby?
We don't get no justice!
Some of these women campaigning outside the High Court in London have had their children taken. They're angry about the policy of adoption without the parents' consent, or as they call it, forced adoption. Britain has one of the highest rates of this type of adoption in Europe. And this begs a key question that's now being asked by campaigners, experts and politicians both here and in Europe.
Are British family courts too quick to take children from their families? And when it comes to forced adoption, is Britain right and the rest of Europe wrong?
There are, of course, good reasons why a social worker might want to remove a child from their family. The shocking case of Victoria Climbié, a 7-year-old girl tortured and murdered by her guardians in 2000, was followed 7 years later by the murder of Peter Connolly, otherwise known as Baby P. Both deaths showed the tragic consequences of not taking action. Since Baby P, the number of children taken into care has risen steadily each year, and adoptions reached their highest level ever recorded last year at 5,050. Around half were forced adoptions. So has the pendulum now swung too far? Most parents who come under the radar of social services will have problems within their family, perhaps emotional, but at what point do those problems mean that a child should be removed? We've come to Hastings to meet Dr. Peter Dale, who worked for many years as a risk advisor for the NSPCC. He believes the system is now taking too many children from their parents.
There's been a very strong tendency in local authorities to conclude too rapidly, in my view, that the families can't provide sufficient care and that the children are supposedly at unacceptable risk, and to move much too quickly in the direction of removing the children and deciding they can't return and placing them for forced adoptions.
In Britain, adoption is a permanent solution. The parents and their children are separated forever and all contact is severed.
You're giving her kisses.
A fate that spurred hundreds of families to leave Britain and start a new life abroad, hoping for more lenient treatment under other jurisdictions.
We've come to France to see a mother from East Sussex who fled here when she was pregnant to avoid having her baby taken at birth.
Originally from Hastings, Gina Holcomb-Jones now lives near Nantes with her partner Tommy. They both have cleaning jobs. When we filmed her last year, she was coping with a very difficult past. Gina has 6 children, but only one, Ruby, the youngest, lives with her in France. The other 5 children were removed by social services in England because of domestic abuse against her. Gina says that since we last filmed, things have improved. French social services are no longer worried about her family.
We can't fault them in any way whatsoever. They've been compassionate, they've been understanding, they've had empathy, spoken to us like we're actually human beings. You don't feel like you're being picked apart by them or attacked. In England, you feel they do. They tear you apart until you're nothing.
Have you actually been cleared here by social services?
Yeah, for Ruby, we got this letter saying they'd closed the case. They didn't even take it to court.
4 out of 5 of Gina's children back in England have been adopted. 1 is being fostered. All of them were taken into care because social workers were concerned about the possibility of domestic abuse. 2 of the children are Tommies.
At the end of the day, the primary reason your children were taken, according to social workers, is fear of violence within your family.
It wasn't so much, well, to a degree, yeah, it's risk of emotional abuse in the future. My children never witnessed an argument, and there was only 2 occasions where things did get violent. And each time it got aggressively violent to that point was after the children had been taken and the family's on complete and utter meltdown.
One fight after the children had been taken ended with Gina in hospital. Tommy served a prison sentence for that attack. As with all care cases, the decision to take Gina's children, although originally made by social workers, was finally made in the courts. Judges nearly always agree with what social workers recommend. Recently, the whole process of making decisions in the court about a child's future has speeded up, so the process should take only 26 weeks. Mark Kerr, who's written a PhD research paper on children in care at the University of Kent, believes it's not long enough.
Sometimes it can take a long time for parents to be able to demonstrate that they can parent a child. In my research, I've come across cases where actually following an adoption, they actually a year or 2 later would have been able to successfully parent that child. So the idea that you can make these decisions quickly, it is, I think, very risky in terms of making errors of judgment.
The new timescales and recent changes to legal aid have had consequences for parents fighting to keep their children in the family courts. Piers Presdy, a QC who specialises in family law, says the legal profession is worried.
Whilst the care proceedings are ongoing, they're entitled to legal aid. Once the care proceedings have terminated, they don't have that automatic right to legal aid. And so the real concern, and it seems to be being expressed at the highest level, is that there are parents who are effectively trying to fight their child being removed in those circumstances who are being denied representation.
Well, I've got this number of replies.
John Hemming MP campaigns on behalf of families fighting social services.
At the moment, the system is going wrong a lot of the time. My estimate always was that over 1,000 children per year were wrongly adopted, and actually more recently, with a different approach to the law, in the sense that people approaching the law the way it should have been approached, the number of placements has gone down quite substantially. But I still think there are many, many wrong decisions that are in the long term very damaging for the children.
It's not just politicians in Britain who have concerns about whether children are sometimes taken from their families unjustly. The issue's been investigated by the Council of Europe.
It published this report last week that recommends avoiding what it calls abusive practices. These are listed as frequently severing family ties completely, removing children at birth, and adoptions without parental consent. The report points out that England and Wales are really unique in Europe for placing so many children for adoption.
Most European countries have forced adoption of some kind, but not on the scale that Britain does. Several countries have no forced adoption at all. One of those is quite close to home.
Currently, Ireland is the most popular destination for families fleeing from UK social services. They can get here quite easily without a passport, and crucially, there's no language barrier.
Do you want some sugar, Mum?
Yeah, please. Yeah, thanks.
Catherine is from Essex. She's a mother of 3. When I met her last year, she was pregnant and had just arrived in Ireland, fleeing UK social services for fear that they were about to take her children and place them into adoption.
We had an assessment completed and we were convinced that on the basis of that assessment they were going to take our children. So we left the UK, got the ferry, We rented a house in Ireland and my husband remained in the UK to support us. It's very hard to be away from the country where you were born.
Why did you think that social services would take your children?
They said that my husband and I did not have a good emotional connection with one another. I don't understand how a social worker who met us once could make that assumption. They concluded in their assessment that there was no evidence of harm, physical, sexual, emotional, no neglect, nothing. But they said that there was possible risk of significant future harm.
One thing that Catherine does that social services don't like is that she smacks her children to discipline them. Last week, Irish social services decided to put her children on the child protection register here. However, Catherine has been allowed to keep her children, but in Brussels, those who've had theirs taken are telling their stories to MEPs before a hearing of the Petitions Committee. Many of the parents bringing their cases here are foreign nationals living in Britain. We met one woman originally from Latvia, now living in London. Her 7-year-old daughter was taken into care after being left home alone. She hasn't seen her since March 2013. She's still battling to get her daughter back, but she's facing a forced adoption and was made to say goodbye.
I knelt down in front of her. I gave her hugs, kisses, and I said, "Now you can trust me. You can trust Mommy, because I told you I'll never stop fighting, and told you it wasn't the final goodbye contact." And afterwards she gave me the kiss, hugs, and she said, "Mommy, I love you. I love you. I want back." That was the last time when I saw her.
After the hearing, we asked the committee for their view of what they'd heard. They sent us a statement which said, "Of major concern is the matter of widespread forced adoptions and the denial of a child's contact with their parent. There is real concern that unfair and unacceptable practices are not at all uncommon in the UK. A fact-finding mission to the UK has indeed been proposed."
Do you think it might one day...
We travelled to Strasbourg to hear more from the Petition Committee Chairman Cecilia Wickstrom, an MEP from Sweden.
We have been aware of an increased number of forced adoptions, and that is of huge concern. In the Charter of Fundamental Rights, we can see in article by article that what is happening, especially in these cases on children and child custody, goes against the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is not legally binding, but it's a matter of principle for the member states to follow. And it is a fundamental right to be a parent.
We did request an interview with the Children's Minister Ed Timpson over what he thought of European concerns about forced adoption in the UK. He wasn't available for comment, but his department gave us a statement.
The ultimate decision to remove a child from their family rests with the court, who are independent and outside of government or local authority influence. The law is also crystal clear that this should only happen when they are sure children are suffering or likely to suffer significant harm.
But the big question in all of this is who's right and who's wrong. Are the British too draconian, or are the rest of Europe simply not that great at child protection?
In the UK, we are continuing to operate a very old-fashioned and very traditional model of adoption, which essentially amounts to repotting the child from one family to another with no subsequent contact with the natural family members. Now, my view is that the time will come in the United Kingdom, in decades to come, who knows when, where the United Kingdom government will be put in a position where it will have to apologise for the past and current practice of forced adoption in this country.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
But we went to meet Andrew Webb from the Association of Directors of Children's Services, who is firmly of the belief that the British system is better.
The criticism of our adoption system isn't based on any evidence that I can see that relates to children and their outcomes. It's more a concern about whether parents should be given more chances than they're given in this country. And I would say the British system, which by many measures is one of the safest systems in the world to grow up. If you're a child, you have better chances here than in much of Europe, fewer chances of being killed by your parents, for example. The child homicide figures in other countries are much higher. So we have a generally safe system. But we also have a system which doesn't believe it's infallible. We challenge the decisions that are taken at every step.
East Sussex Social Services can't comment on individual cases, but they did tell us that they're concerned about parents fleeing the country, as it could leave both mother and child at greater risk. Where are the parents in all this? Do social services not have any kind of responsibility for their well-being whatsoever?
The parents' well-being is important, but the child's interests are paramount. So if we have to make a decision between the short-term interests of the parents and the long-term interests of the child, the law is quite clear on that. We have to make the child's interest paramount.
While a better safe than sorry attitude is one way of deciding the best interests of the child, there's no question that forced adoption is leaving many parents feeling helpless and bereft. Gina still buys presents for her children every Christmas and for each of their birthdays, even though she knows she may never see them again.
I've kept every last thing of theirs, even down to the smallest little bit of paper that they might have held. It's hard because it's all there, but I don't want to go through it because I don't want to lose the smells of clothes and stuff. I try and keep it locked up as securely as possible, so when I do get that moment where I really can't cope and I don't want to live no more, that's what gets me through. Is I'll open a box and I'll smell their clothes and I'll remember